Hello again, everybody. I'm so excited to share some more thoughts with you tonight. I wish I could be doing it in person, but I actually think it's really timely the way this has worked out. The fact that I'm sharing these with you now in this way, and the fact that today is Palm Sunday. I'm really excited about that, and I think you'll see why soon. We're going to pick up just where we left off, zeroing in on 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. As usual, we're going to be looking at several other books in the Bible to help us get a fuller picture of what's really going on. If any of you are new, or just as a reminder for the rest of us, actually, I would really encourage you to read Acts chapter 17, which gives important contextual background for what we're going to read and study right now, and also Zechariah chapters 9 through 14, sometimes known as 2nd Zechariah, which provides really important Jewish imagery that Paul draws from in this letter. Once again, in this passage, we see a surprising mixture of metaphors and images from both Jewish and Roman cultures. We'll walk through this passage verse by verse, but first, I want to start actually with the last verse in the passage, number 11, because it has a really important reminder for us. Just like the previous passage that we looked at in chapter 4, Paul finishes these thoughts by instructing his readers to encourage one another with these words. Then he adds to that they should build each other up. Okay? So as we study this passage, it's crucial for us to bear in mind that these are not just religious ideas that should stay in our heads. These are powerful truths that can actually change lives. All right, so let's keep that in mind. The first big idea in this passage is the day of the Lord. Far from being some random phrase, this is actually a really important concept in several of the prophetic books in the Hebrew Bible. Sometimes this involves apocalyptic events, violence, but the most important thing about the day of the Lord is that it is the ultimate time of judgment. And we're going to come back to judgment very soon. The next big idea comes in verse 3. It says, when they say, there is peace and security. And it's really useful for us to question who the they is in this verse, okay? Here, Paul is specifically referring to the Roman Empire and its leaders. At the time Paul is writing this letter, the empire had experienced about 80 years of unprecedented peace, which began in 31 BC when Octavius Augustus defeated Mark Antony. The phrase was literally used as propaganda by the empire and printed on coins of the time. And it had become such a common idea that a guy named Seneca the Younger basically invented or described it really close to the time Paul is writing this letter, actually, with a phrase I'm sure you've heard, Pax Romana. Okay? So Paul is doing a few different things by using this Roman phrase. First of all, he's probably mocking the Roman Empire a little bit, because the way that they had come by peace and security was through a lot of treachery and bloodshed. But more importantly, Paul is making some predictions about future events that will happen. And they do happen, some of them, in less than 20 years after this letter is sent, when the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed, and lots of other events came after that, but the Pax Romana is effectively kind of ruined at that point. Paul is also recalling more Jewish imagery from times past when false prophets had assured the people of Israel that everything was okay, even though it wasn't okay. The next idea in our passage is the labor pains of a pregnant woman, which is also a really well-known Jewish image. You might wonder what the point is of using this metaphor when we had just had the previous metaphor in the verse right before it of the thief in the night. To summarize a couple hours of reading that I did, I think the main difference is this. The thief comes suddenly, but is totally unexpected, which is how the day of the Lord is probably going to take place. That's how it's depicted in a lot of Jewish literature, and maybe how it's depicted in Zechariah 13, verse 8. The woman in labor pains, however, experiences a sudden change that is very expected because the baby has been in the womb growing for 9 months. Paul seems to suggest that hopefully this is what is going to happen for his readers, and he wishes it upon everybody really who believes in Christ, that his coming will be sudden, but we will be anticipating it, we will be expecting it. Then Paul introduces the idea that Christians are children of the light and children of the day. There is so much we could say about the idea of light in the Bible. We could easily do an entire 8-week Bible study on the idea of light. But I think it's pretty well understood by a lot of you, pretty easy to understand in comparison with some other things in this passage. So I'm actually just going to breeze right by it for tonight. In verse 6, Paul brings up the idea of sleep, and he does it in a very tricky way, actually, because he is mixing metaphors. We don't see it quite as easily in our English translations, but our passage in chapter 5 is very closely related and connected to the previous passage in chapter 4, which also describes sleep. And of course, when this was first written, there were no chapter breakups, so it's just all the flow of Paul's thought. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, the text literally describes those who have fallen asleep in verses 13, 14, and 15. And then in verse 16 of chapter 4, that metaphor is equated with death. Paul uses the word nekros to describe those who are dead. But here in chapter 5, verse 6, Paul uses the ideas of being awake and asleep to really encourage his readers towards purity and alertness. And then, by the way, in verse 10, he switches back to sleep as a metaphor for death. Now, some scholars really get thrown off and bothered by this, but I think it actually makes sense when we consider the way that Paul thinks about death. So in places like Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about death as something more than just the moment when we die. He talks about it as something that has dominion over us, okay? And death is anything that kind of pulls us away from the ultimate life, the true life that God wants for us. So some of the Thessalonians have died, and that is tragic. They might have been martyred, but Paul is saying that the same Jesus who conquered death, I think this is what he's saying, the same Jesus who conquered death is going to resurrect them and resurrect everybody else who is struggling with different aspects of death reigning in our fallen world, okay? One last note on day and night. Because the day of the Lord is still coming, the picture here is basically saying that we are currently in the night, in the darkness, and we are awaiting the first signs of the morning. This is at least one of the reasons why Jesus refers to himself in the book of Revelation as the morning star, and also why basically every traditional church that was built was facing east, anticipating the rising of the sun and the coming of the resurrection. All right? At this point, we now need to turn to Matthew chapter 25, which is quoted by a lot of the church fathers when discussing this passage in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, and rightly so. Matthew 25 begins with the story of the 10 virgins who go out to meet the bridegroom and then fall asleep. The bridegroom happens to arrive at midnight, just like the thief in our passage, and the same exact technical term is used to describe they're meeting the bridegroom that Paul uses to describe the people meeting the Lord in the air. That's 1 Thessalonians 4:17. I wrestled for a while with reconciling the idea that Jesus seems to come at midnight with the idea that he's the morning star, coming with the morning and the day. We are people of the day. And this is what I came up with. It might not be exactly right, but I think it's pretty good. The welcome party, right, the delegation that's sent out to meet the Lord, goes outside the city and begins at midnight, which makes sense of those who are alert when Jesus comes like a thief in the night suddenly. And then this also means the darkness correlates quite nicely with the air being Satan's territory. But by the time the welcome party comes back to the city, morning has arrived. And by that time, it's too late for everybody else. They've missed the welcome party. They didn't go out and greet the Lord. And so Matthew 25 says, but the other 5 virgins who weren't prepared are shut out. Before we go back to 1 Thessalonians, let's stay in Matthew 25. I want to jump to verse 31. This passage is important, first of all, because it uses a modified version of a phrase we saw earlier in 1 Thessalonians, okay, in chapter 3, verse 13. Matthew 25 says, when the Son of Man comes in glory, glory is also another prominent theme in our letter, and all his angels with them, right? That's the phrase that Paul borrows from Zechariah. Even though Matthew 25 doesn't explicitly say it's the day of the Lord, clearly this is an ultimate judgment scene going on. And it's significant because Jesus refers to himself as king, which he very rarely does in the New Testament. Now, if you remember, Acts 17, verse 7, specifically accuses the Christians in Thessalonica for calling Jesus king, which is also pretty unique for the New Testament. So I think it makes perfect sense that Paul would so carefully contrast King Jesus with the Roman emperor. In this particular letter, he's writing to these people in Thessalonica. Another side note. Ever since Octavian became emperor, the rulers of the empire were in the habit of calling themselves divine, adopted sons of God, which gives even more meaning to the way that Jesus describes himself and the way that he is contrasted with contemporary rulers of that day. And now is where it gets most exciting for me. We already saw that Paul quoted from Zechariah chapter 9 when he talked about the trumpet sounding in chapter 4. Okay? Now in chapter 5 of 1 Thessalonians, he finishes off his contrast of Jesus as king by drawing from earlier in Zechariah chapter 9. In verse 9, this is what it says. Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He will cut off the chariot from Ephraim, and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall command peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. So Paul is arguing here that the true king brings true peace, not through military conquest or through violence like the Romans did, but through his humble and sacrificial death, which Paul very briefly mentions in verse 10 of our passage. Of course, Paul has a much fuller picture of these things because he is writing after Jesus had come and accomplished much of this. So it makes total sense that a lot of the Jews, and Zechariah as well, but a lot of the Jews were expecting and looking for a powerful military leader as king to overthrow and defeat the Romans. Think about it. A lot of the greatest rulers and leaders had been military heroes. Think about Saul. Think about David. In the contemporary time, think about Julius Caesar and Tiberius and Titus and Trajan and Hadrian. It was common for rulers and leaders to prove their capabilities on the battlefield and then be promoted to these positions, okay? But on Palm Sunday, Jesus enters Jerusalem in the way described by Zechariah chapter 9, and he begins to demonstrate that he has a very different plan for accomplishing his victory. Now you can see why I was so excited to talk about these things on Palm Sunday. One last thing I want to say. We've already noted Paul's famous faith, hope, love formula that he uses in the first chapter of this letter. But he uses that formula here to talk about armor. And at first glance, it might seem kind of strange that he's talking about armor when there's so many other images of peace going on. But I think the book of Zechariah can, again, really help us out here. In that book, in the final chapters of Zechariah, indeed, it points towards the ultimate, final peace that God will bring. But it also describes the way that God will strengthen his people and make them like warriors. So Zechariah is very clear that it's God who's fighting the battle. It's God who ultimately accomplishes the victory. But he also describes how God's people will be involved. They need to prepare for battle. They will be like a bow and like a sword in the hand of God. There's tons more that I would like to talk about, but I'm going to stop there for the sake of time. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments below. That would be great. If you want some bonus ideas for homework, check out Psalm 118, which is also referenced at Jesus' triumphal entry. And also consider the way that both Zechariah and Matthew chapter 25 depict a powerful, glorious king as a shepherd who cares for his people. Okay? Again, please encourage one another with these words and think about ways you can use them to build each other up. Bye.